The first time Michael Trent saw his 1967 Mustang, he was 17 years old and knee-deep in a summer job washing cars at a dusty lot on the edge of town. It wasn't for sale. It wasn't even running. But something about it, sunlight bouncing off the pitted chrome, the way the lines curved with both menace and grace, lodged in his brain like a memory from the future. Years later, after a stint in Quantico and over a decade with the FBI, he found one just like it at an auction outside Baltimore. Restoring it became his quiet rebellion against everything he'd seen in the field. Wrench by wrench, he rebuilt that car the same way he built his family, slowly, deliberately, with every ounce of care he had. When it got keyed, it wasn't just vandalism. It was a message. He knew at the moment he saw it, parallel gashes down the driver's side door, surgically clean, not some sloppy teenage prank. There was discipline in the cuts. Control. Whoever did this had taken their time. And that made his skin crawl. The Mustang sat in the driveway like it always had. A ritual. Sunday mornings polishing it, late summer evenings tinkering with the ignition while his son Benji handed him tools. That car wasn't just his, it was theirs. Which made the damage feel personal in a way nothing else could. Michael stood motionless in the doorway, his coffee going cold. He'd seen worse, far worse, in his career. But this wasn't work. This was his life, his family, his safe place. And someone had just drawn first blood. He didn't call the police. Not immediately. He already knew how that would go. A report filed, maybe a cursory patrol. Vandalism wasn't high on anyone's priority list unless it came with a body count. So he took his own photos. Noticed the clean entry through the side gate, the disturbed mulch near the window. Whoever had come onto his property knew exactly where the blind spots were, between the motion sensor and the east fence. Too precise to be luck. And yet, what disturbed him more than the marks on the car was the feeling, like someone had been watching. Not just last night, but for weeks. That prickling sensation between his shoulder blades, the tiny clicks in his home router he'd chalked up to firmware glitches. In hindsight, all signs were there. He'd just been too absorbed in trying to rebuild his relationship with Benji to notice. Benji had changed. At 17, he'd grown quieter, less eager to work on the car, more tethered to his phone than to the world around him. Michael had chalked it up to adolescence, stress from school, a shifting peer group. But now, staring at the vandalism, he started connecting dots. The timing. The sudden animosity from neighbors. The anonymous complaint letters about his lawn. The HOA meetings he wasn't invited to. Something was wrong, and it was spreading. The homeowners association had always been a nuisance. Michael had dealt with plenty of petty tyrants in his career, but Karen, the new HOA president, brought a level of zeal that bordered on pathological. Fines for trash bins visible from the street, notices about excessive leaf debris, even a citation for having his American flag displayed at a non-regulation angle. At first, he'd laughed it off. A bored bureaucrat with too much time. But after the Mustang was keyed, the pattern took on a new shape. He reviewed everything again that evening. Photos, timestamps from his home security footage. Nothing. The cameras had been wiped clean. Files missing. Not corrupted, deleted. Someone with network access, or at least a sophisticated enough signal jammer. He called Ray. Ray had been his digital counterpart back at the bureau, now technically retired, but Michael knew better. Ray didn't retire. He simply stopped drawing a government paycheck. These days, he freelanced in cybersecurity and owed Michael more than a few favors. Within hours, Ray had remote access to Michael's home network and a look of concern that traveled clearly over the encrypted call. "You've got a backdoor running on your home router," Ray said. "It's a zero-day exploit, custom-coded. This isn't script kiddie stuff. Someone put a lot of time into this. Can you trace it? I can try. But whoever did this isn't just skilled, they're funded." That word sat heavy in the room. Funded. Over the next 48 hours, the picture filled in with alarming speed. Ray traced fragments of the intrusion back to a private contractor that had previously done behavioral research under DHS grants. The contractor's public-facing entity was listed as Vantage Resolutions, a benign-sounding firm supposedly focused on community optimization. Buried in their history, though, were ties to social engineering experiments, surveillance platforms, and residential control programs under the guise of HOA digital modernization. In short, they were testing how much psychological pressure a single person or household could withstand before cracking. Michael wasn't just the subject of harassment. He was the subject of a study. It was surreal. Everything around him, his street, his neighborhood, the committee meetings, even the PDA squabbles, could have been manipulated elements in a controlled experiment. And worse, they'd managed to rope in people close to him. He was sure of it. The name Ethan surfaced next. A junior at Benji's high school, sharp, charismatic, and politically active. He ran a podcast that flirted with anti-authoritarian ideas, but had recently pivoted toward more targeted rhetoric, episodes about legacy privilege and parental fascism, clearly modeled to resonate with young audiences rebelling against traditional figures. Ray's scraping tools pulled metadata that showed IP cross-links between Ethan's uploads and a private server operated by Mason, an elusive hacker for hire who'd once built honeypots for corporate counterintelligence. Benji had recently become one of Ethan's regular guests. Michael's stomach twisted as he listened to an episode. It wasn't just teen angst. It was methodical narrative shaping. His son, his own flesh and blood, was being used to destabilize him from within. The Mustang wasn't just defaced, it was symbolic. A scar across their shared history. He confronted Benji that night. No yelling. Just honesty. A father trying to reach the boy who once rode shotgun beside him with grease on his jeans and a grin that split his face in half. "Did you know?" Michael asked. "About Ethan? About what they're doing to this family?" Benji hesitated. then nodded barely. I didn't know how deep it went. Mason said it was just a way to shake things up. To see how far people will bend. I didn't know they were watching us. I didn't know they'd touch the Mustang. Michael sat down, all the air gone from his lungs. The betrayal hurt, but not as much as the look on Benji's face, raw regret, confusion, and shame fighting behind his eyes. He wasn't the enemy. He was a kid who'd been caught in a current too fast and too complex to escape from alone. They talked for hours, and somewhere between the tears and the anger, they made a decision: fight back. Ray came over the next day with tools, digital and otherwise. A signal scrambling perimeter to block outside surveillance. A restored backup of the security logs. And most importantly, a map of the network. Digital nodes that connected Karen, Ethan, Mason, and a web of pseudonymous accounts orchestrating the campaign. They weren't just targeting Michael. They were running a full-scale operation. And someone somewhere was paying for it. Karen's role, as it turned out, wasn't just HOA president. She was the local conduit for Vantage, tasked with identifying high-resilience households for testing. Michael's background, his federal history, his profile as both agent and father, made him the perfect mark. What they didn't count on was his ability to hit back with precision. Michael had always believed that the most effective threats were the ones you never saw coming. That was how the Bureau operated in its deepest shadows: patience, strategy, quiet leverage. Now, that same philosophy was being used against him, and his entire life had become a test tube. But the problem with running experiments on trained professionals was simple. Sometimes the subject bites back. Armed with Ray's forensics and a chilling awareness of how deep the operation ran, Michael began laying groundwork. Not for revenge, though the urge flickered constantly at the edge of his thoughts, but for exposure. The world they constructed around him had seams, cracks where truth could leak out. It was no longer about restoring a car or mending fences with his son. It was about pulling down the veil they'd built over his neighborhood, one thread at a time. He started with Karen. On the surface, she maintained her image as an overzealous neighborhood enforcer. Complaints about grass height and mailbox paint codes had escalated in recent weeks. But Michael saw through it now. Every fine, every public confrontation was calibrated, not just to punish, but to isolate. Isolation bred vulnerability. Vulnerability invited collapse. Ray tracked Karen's digital activity to a secure dashboard hosted offshore. Buried in that dashboard were data streams, logs of household activity in the community, facial recognition matches from neighborhood surveillance, and behavioral scores assigned to residents. Michael had a file. So did others. Each resident had been assigned risk thresholds, stress factors, and projected breaking points. It was all so clinical. So cold. They call it Vantage Protocol Level 2, Ray said, flicking through the decrypted files. It's not just surveillance, it's psychological warfare. They're running multi-household scenarios, logging response patterns to stimulus. Think Skinner box, but with families. Michael looked at his profile. A color-coded grid tracked his routines, arguments overheard by smart devices, even fluctuations in Benji's school attendance. The Mustang's vandalism was listed as an escalation marker. Someone had literally written, "Observe subject's tolerance to legacy property defacement. Phase B pending response." It wasn't personal. That, somehow, made it worse. What passed for reality in his neighborhood was now just another interface in a test chamber. And the deeper Michael went, the more grotesque it became. Neighborly disputes weren't organic, they were engineered. Passive-aggressive lawn disputes were tools for measuring conflict escalation. HOA town halls? Social pressure metrics. Even the community email list had been co-opted to test ideological positioning. He found the camera hidden behind the faux birdhouse 2 doors down. The lens glinted under a flashlight when he stepped onto a ladder at 2 a.m. He disabled it quietly, pocketing the SD card for Ray to dissect. The data on it showed his daily walks, annotated by software that tracked hand gestures and emotional tone. They had built a profile on him richer than anything the Bureau had ever assembled for domestic targets. All to optimize the American community experience. It was then Michael remembered Kaiser, his old mentor from Quantico. A man who had pioneered early interrogation analytics before stepping away quietly into private consulting. The last time Michael had seen him, he'd been vague about his post-government work. Advisory mostly. Human behavioral stuff, he'd said. That was years ago. Now, the idea hit like a punch to the gut. Ray did a deep search. Kaiser was on the board of advisors for a shell firm funding Vantage. Michael didn't know what burned worse, the betrayal of a man he respected, or the realization that this had been coming long before the first scratch appeared on his car. He wasn't just a test subject. He was a milestone. Benji, for his part, stepped forward in ways Michael hadn't expected. The truth had cracked something open in him. Where guilt once anchored him down, now there was resolve. The boy who once parroted Ethan's podcast slogans now helped dismantle them. He handed over private chat logs, burner usernames, even a local server where Mason had uploaded their coordination plans. Those plans were terrifying. The goal wasn't just to destabilize families. It was to determine which narratives, financial pressure, social ostracism, generational tension, worked fastest. They were building a formula for societal fracture. And Ethan? He was just a recruiter. His charismatic rants weren't spontaneous. They were pre-scripted trials for emotional resonance. Benji had even seen him rehearse. "I thought he was real," Benji said. "I thought we were making change. But it was all fake." Michael knew that disillusionment well. It came with growing up. But what made him proud, and scared, was how quickly Benji adapted. He wasn't a pawn anymore. He was an ally. Together, with Ray's help, they mapped out a counterplan. Phase 1 was exposure. Not through legal channels, they were already compromised, but through digital noise. Ray helped set up a mirror server loaded with vantage documents, video evidence, and internal memos that linked Mason to the operation. They didn't just leak it to press outlets. They leaked it to parents groups, school forums, community watchdogs. Anywhere the human cost would hit hardest, phase 2 was disruption. Michael reached out to 2 other former agents who'd been in similar neighborhoods. One in Arizona, one in Pennsylvania. Each had noticed strange patterns. Each had similar HOA stories. Together, they coordinated a release, synchronized data drops, public FOIA requests, and live-streamed panels explaining how suburban surveillance was being masked as local governance. Vantage went into damage control mode. Karen resigned from the HOA within days, citing personal health reasons. Ethan deleted his entire digital presence overnight. Mason vanished, but the system didn't collapse. Not entirely. Like any virus, it tried to evolve. Another HOA enforcer stepped in. A quieter one, who claimed to want healing in the community. But Michael wasn't done. He and Ray tracked Mason to a compound just outside Chicago, a tech hub masquerading as a collaborative innovation space. With federal contacts and legal backing now moving into play, they coordinated a sweep. No dramatic arrests. No headlines. But within a month, the entire Vantage protocol database was seized. And Mason? Caught on camera destroying drives with a sledgehammer. He'd known it was over. Michael kept the Mustang scars. He could have repainted the door, replaced the panel. But he didn't. The gouges remained as a reminder, not of victimhood, but of endurance. There were no parades. No news retrospectives. But slowly, things returned to some version of normal. Benji graduated. Ray got a consulting gig with a watchdog group. And Michael? He just kept living. Mowing his lawn. Drinking coffee. Watching the sun hit the chrome in the driveway. Because he knew now what the real war looked like. And he'd already won the first round. Michael Trent wasn't sleeping much. Even after the takedown of the operation, after the arrests and the revelations, after Karen and Ethan and Mason were exposed and the HOA was gutted from the inside out, his mind still whirred in the early hours of the morning. The war was over, at least the visible one, but its echoes hadn't yet left his house. There were too many ghosts. It wasn't the kind of insomnia driven by fear. It was something more complicated, part adrenaline residue, part grief, part relentless analysis. He kept replaying everything that had happened, like a puzzle with no final piece, because deep down, he wasn't sure it was really over. You don't dismantle something that calculated, that well-funded and invisible, and expect it to die quietly. You just drive it underground. You delay its next mutation. During the day, Michael tried to return to something resembling normal life. The kitchen still smelled of coffee, and the wooden porch still creaked beneath his boots. The Mustang, battered and scarred, was back in the garage. He refused to fully restore the driver's side panel. The scratches, like wounds half healed, remained as a reminder. Not of what had been taken, but of what had survived. Benji didn't bring up the operation anymore. After the confrontation, the apologies, the sobbing late-night confession that had shattered whatever remained of Michael's stoic resolve, they'd agreed, without words, to move forward, not backward. But moving forward required more than silence. It required attention. Daily, deliberate effort. Some mornings they'd sit outside and share breakfast without speaking a word. Other days, they'd work side by side on the car, quietly falling back into their old rhythms. The clink of metal on metal, the steady breathing of a father and son trying to make sense of each other again. Benji's betrayal hadn't come from malice. It had come from confusion, from disillusionment, from being young and feeling unheard. Mason and Ethan had known exactly how to exploit that. They hadn't just manipulated a teenager, they'd engineered him. The same way they tried to engineer Michael's downfall, by using emotion, by isolating, by poking until he bled. Michael thought often about the ethics of what had happened. About the sick genius behind Operation Vantage. It wasn't just a smear campaign. It was a case study in behavioral degradation. A psychological crucible. Target a man's legacy, his home, his child, erode each one slowly, and observe what breaks first. What made it all so monstrous was how clinical it had been. The emotional brutality wasn't an accident. It was the objective. When Ray had pulled the last fragments of the operation's internal notes, one line had stood out in particular. It had been part of a summary report compiled by Mason before his final live stream. Subject Trent has entered the fracture threshold. Expect emotional volatility, risk of escalation. The language stuck with Michael. Not because it was accurate, but because of how neatly it attempted to box him in. As if you could reduce a person to a predictable reaction. As if trauma was a lab rat, obedient to the experiment. And yet, they had been close. Michael had felt the pull. There were moments when rage nearly consumed him. When he'd sat on the porch with a loaded weapon on his lap, just watching. Waiting. He told himself it was protection, but he knew better. There had been something darker beneath the surface. The desire to strike back. To burn it all down. The Mustang had nearly pushed him over the edge. Not because it was just a car, but because it had been the one sacred space left untouched between him and Benji. After Mason's arrest, federal investigators had taken over the inquiry. Ray's digital footprints were clean enough, and Michael's involvement had been masked by burner proxies and timed releases. It wasn't just about avoiding attention, it was about preserving the narrative. If the government had any intention of prosecuting the operation's funders, they didn't show it. But Michael didn't need courtroom justice. He needed something more durable. Understanding.so, he wrote .at first, just scribbles. Memories. Events. Timelines. But soon it turned into something more formal. A record. Not for publication, not for fame. For his son. For his future grandchildren. For whoever came next. Because this wasn't going to be the last time a community was weaponized. The mechanics of Vantage were too efficient, too subtle, too scalable. It would evolve. It would find new forms. But if people could recognize the signs early enough, maybe they wouldn't have to endure what Michael's family did. He outlined everything. The fake surveys. The reprogrammed community apps. The whisper campaigns. The deliberate social isolation. The introduction of fines, then fees, then legal threats. And always, the cameras. There had been cameras everywhere. The story gained a quiet cult following when parts of it were leaked anonymously. Whistleblower forums. Privacy watchdog groups. A few ex-federal agents reached out. A couple professors of psychology. A former cybersecurity officer who claimed to have seen similar patterns in other communities. Places where homeowners suddenly faced inexplicable pressure campaigns from within their own associations. Michael read every message, responded to most. He didn't pose as a hero. He wasn't one. He'd made mistakes. Had blind spots. Failed to see the signs soon enough. Failed, most of all, to reach his son before the operation did. But the healing had begun. One afternoon in spring, Benji came home from school holding a printed essay. It was something he'd written for his senior English class, an assignment about moral courage. Michael read it twice. In it, Benji described. A man who had been trained to face bullets, but was nearly undone by bureaucracy. A man who stayed standing not because he wasn't afraid, but because he chose to act even when it cost him everything. Benji didn't name his father in the piece, but Michael didn't need to see his own name to know. He cried that night, not in front of Benji, but later, in the garage, under the glow of the same dangling bulb they'd worked under for years. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't crying out of pain. It was something closer to release. The Mustang roared to life the following weekend. Not perfect, not silent, but running. The two of them took it for a spin down the mountain road that circled their town. The air was crisp. The trees still bore the fingerprints of winter, but spring was cracking them open again. As the car curved through the switchbacks, Michael glanced over and saw Benji smiling, not the forced smile of appeasement, but a real one. Free of guilt. Free of fear. There was no ceremony, no announcement, but something shifted that day. A kind of invisible repair. A bridge reconnected. Not fully, not easily, but enough to carry weight again. Michael knew the world wasn't getting any safer. The tools Vantage had used were already outdated. Deepfakes were improving. AI-driven smear campaigns could be launched by teenagers with open-source code. Public trust was a commodity traded like oil. But he also knew this, people still mattered. Not as abstractions, not as profiles or case studies. As families. As fathers. As sons. He never fully stopped watching. Never completely turned off the internal profiler. But he stopped expecting the worst of people. The worst had already come, and it hadn't won. Months later, he attended a small conference on digital rights. Sat in the back. Said nothing. Watched as panelists discussed privacy laws and community surveillance networks. At one point, someone mentioned a case study. A suburban psychological experiment involving a former federal agent. And the room leaned in. Michael just smiled. Afterward, a young woman approached him, maybe 26, holding a tablet and a press badge. She asked if he believed what happened to him could happen again. He looked at her for a long moment, then said, "It already is. The question is, how many people will recognize it before it's too late?" She thanked him, scribbled something, and walked away. He didn't give her his name. Later that night, as he stood under the stars with Reaper at his side, and the house lit from within, Benji laughing in the kitchen, the scent of dinner drifting into the yard, he felt something rare. Not triumph, not peace, but wholeness. Wounded, yes. But still whole. The world hadn't beaten him. It had tried. It had weaponized law and fear and technology, and even his own blood. But it had failed. He was still here, and that was enough.